The wind was sharp that morning, carrying dust and dry leaves across the open plains. A single wagon rolled slow along the uneven trail, the wooden wheels creaking as if the land itself was groaning. Inside sat a woman, her gloved hands gripping the reins tight, her belly rounded beneath a worn cotton dress. She looked no older than 30, yet her face carried the kind of tired that only hardship could carve. She had been on the road for days, maybe weeks, with little more than a stubborn mule. A cracked map and a letter promising land she could finally call her own. The ranch was supposed to be her fresh start. She had spent every penny she had, and some she didn't, to buy it sight unseen. Folks back in town had warned her that the West was no place for a woman alone, especially one in her condition. But she had smiled, thanked them kindly, and gone anyway. She had lost too much already to turn back now. All she wanted was a quiet place, a roof over her head, and a chance to raise her child somewhere the world might leave them be. When the wagon crested the last hill, she saw it at last, a stretch of golden grassland fading into scrub, framed by distant hills. A line of old wooden fences ran crooked along the edge, half swallowed by time. In the middle stood a ranch house, sagging a little to one side, its porch slanted and roof patched with tin. It wasn't much, but to her, it was everything. Her heart thudded in her chest as she pulled the mule to a stop and climbed down. One hand resting over her stomach, the first steps toward the house were heavy. The yard was littered with broken tools, a rusted plow, and what looked like the remains of a windmill. But it was quiet, no dogs barking, no voices, no signs of life. The letter from the seller had said it was abandoned, and now she believed it. She brushed her hair from her eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under her boots. When she pushed open the door, the hinges screamed like they hadn't moved in years. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. Sunlight cut through cracks in the shutters, painting thin stripes across the floor. There were a few old chairs, a stove with a dented pipe, and a bed frame without a mattress. She dropped her small bag near the door and let out a shaky breath. Home, she whispered. It didn't feel like much, but it was hers now. She started cleaning, sweeping dust from corners and airing out the rooms. Every sound echoed, the broom scratching, the boards groaning, the wind pressing against the windows. As the hours passed, she tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up her back. Maybe it was just the loneliness, or the way the light kept shifting, like something moved just out of sight. When the sun began to dip behind the hills, the sky turned a deep red, and the ranch looked like it was on fire from the glow. She stepped outside to fetch water from the well and noticed something strange. The air had gone still. Not even the crickets were singing. Her mule stamped the ground nervously, ears twitching toward the far end of the property. She followed its gaze. Beyond the barn, something tall and dark swayed slightly in the fading light. At first, she thought it was a scarecrow, maybe left by the previous owner. But as she walked closer, her breath caught. It wasn't a scarecrow. Hanging from the beam of the old windmill tower was a man, or what looked like one, large and still as stone. His skin was darkened by sun and dirt, his hair long and braided. The ropes were frayed, the kind that had been up there too long. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She froze, unable to move, her mind trying to make sense of it. Then she saw the feathers tied into his hair, the beaded necklace around his neck, and realized what she was looking at, an Apache warrior. Fear rushed through her. She stumbled back a step, clutching her belly. No one had told her anything about this when she bought the place. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She forced herself to look again, expecting decay or death, but something didn't fit. The man's body wasn't stiff or lifeless. His chest, she could swear, moved slightly, like a breath too faint to trust. Her throat went dry. She took another cautious step forward, listening. The rope creaked softly in the breeze, and that's when she saw his fingers twitch. It was small, almost nothing, but enough to make her stumble backward in shock. He wasn't dead. Somehow, after all this time, he was alive. She stood there, frozen, torn between fear and pity. The Apaches had a fierce reputation. She had heard stories, raids on ranches, men found missing. Burned wagons, though most of those tales came from frightened settlers who never saw anything themselves. Still, she was alone, unarmed, and carrying a child. The last thing she needed was to get close to someone who might be dangerous. But then another thought came. What if he wasn't a threat? What if someone had done this to him unjustly? The West had its share of cruelty, especially toward people like him. She looked at his wrists, tied behind him, at the deep marks where the rope had rubbed the skin raw. Whoever had done this hadn't meant for him to live. The evening wind picked up again, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust. She could hear the faint creak of the rope and her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She couldn't leave him hanging there, not if he was still breathing. But if she cut him down, what then? Would he turn on her? Would he even survive? Her eyes moved toward the barn where her hatchet lay among the supplies. Every step toward it felt heavier than the last. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting him to open his eyes. By the time she reached the tool, her hands were shaking. She gripped the handle tight and whispered under her breath that she was only doing what was right, not because she was brave, but because no one deserved to die like that. When she returned to the windmill, the light was almost gone. The Apache hung motionless again, head bowed forward. She took a slow breath and began climbing the lower rungs, her heart hammering so hard she could barely think. The rope was thick, but she found the knot and raised the hatchet. One swing, and it would be over. One swing, and she might have saved a life or doomed herself. Her arms trembled. She hesitated, staring at the man's face. It was strong and proud, even in that broken position. Then his eyes opened. She gasped, the hatchet slipping from her hand. They were dark, deep, and full of something she couldn't name. Not anger, not fear, but something old and wild. His lips moved, forming words she didn't understand, soft and low like a prayer. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The world seemed to hold its breath with them. Then the wind shifted, and the rope groaned again. She stumbled back down, her heart pounding in her throat. The hatchet lay in the dirt, the shadows swallowing the last light of the day. The Apache's eyes were still open, following her as she backed away toward the house. By the time she reached the porch, the night had fallen fully, and the stars blinked sharp and cold above the plain. She sank onto the steps, clutching her swollen belly, trying to calm her breathing. The silence around her felt heavier now, almost watchful. Out by the windmill, the figure still hung, barely visible in the dark. But she could feel it that she wasn't alone anymore, whether she had found salvation or something far more dangerous. She didn't yet know, and as the wind carried a low, almost human sound across the empty field, she realized sleep would not come easy that night. The night dragged on in slow, heavy silence. The woman sat by the dim light of a single lantern, her hands cupped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. Every small sound in that old house made her flinch, the boards settling, the faint rattle of the shutters, the sigh of wind brushing the walls. Out there beyond the porch, she could still see the faint outline of the windmill. The figure was motionless now, but she could not forget the moment those eyes opened. She kept telling herself maybe she had imagined it. Maybe the light had played tricks on her, or her mind had wandered after too many sleepless nights on the trail. But deep down she knew what she'd seen. Those eyes were alive. She'd seen life flicker in them, faint but real. Like an ember refusing to die, she tried to rest. But the floorboards groaned beneath every shift, and the thought of that man out there hanging, breathing, watching, refused to leave her alone. By the time the first hint of morning touched the horizon, she was already up, her body sore and mind restless. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out onto the porch. The dawn light painted the land in pale gold, and a low fog clung to the grass. She looked toward the windmill. The Apache was still there, hanging limp. For a long moment she just stood watching, unsure what to do. The baby shifted inside her. She took that as a sign, a reminder that doing nothing wasn't an option. She made her way slowly across the field, boots damp from dew. When she reached the tower, the air felt colder, heavier somehow. She could see now the marks around his wrists, the cuts along his arms, the deep bruises on his chest. Whoever had left him there hadn't done it out of mercy. The sight made her heart twist with pity. She reached out carefully and touched his shoulder. His skin was cold, but not lifeless. When she pressed her fingers to his neck, she felt it, a faint, stubborn pulse. He was alive. Somehow, against all reason, he had survived hanging there for God knows how long. She stepped back and wiped her hands on her dress, her thoughts spinning. If she left him there, he would die. If she cut him down, she'd have to deal with what came after, and she wasn't sure which frightened her more. But something deep inside told her that saving him might be the only right thing left she could do. With shaky hands, she picked up the hatchet again. The wood felt rough against her palm as she climbed part way up the tower. The knot was tight and old, worn hard by wind and sun, but after a few careful swings, the rope began to fray. The last hit split it clean, and the man dropped into the dirt below with a heavy thud. She rushed down, half expecting him to spring up, but he didn't move. His breathing was shallow, and his skin looked gray beneath the grime. She dragged him with all her strength toward the barn, grunting and trembling under the effort. Her back burned and her belly ached, but she didn't stop until he was inside. Laid out on a pile of dry hay, for a long time, she just stood there staring at him, unsure what to do next. He looked strong even in weakness, broad shoulders, rough hands, a face marked by both pride and pain. She fetched water from the well and wiped the dirt from his skin, then cut away the rope around his wrists. The deep grooves in his flesh made her jaw tighten. Whoever tied him had meant for him to suffer as she worked. She kept glancing toward the open barn door, afraid someone might ride up. If anyone from town found out she was harboring an Apache, they might turn on her too. She had heard the way they spoke of his kind savages, thieves, raiders, but she had also heard whispers that white men had done worse to them first. She didn't know the truth, only that the man before her didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone the world had tried to destroy and failed by noon. He stirred faintly, his head turning toward the light. She froze where she stood. His eyes opened again, slower this time, blinking against the brightness. For a heartbeat, he seemed lost, not knowing where he was. Then his gaze found her. He didn't speak, only watched her in silence. She held up her hands slightly. "You're safe," she said softly. "No one's going to hurt you here." He didn't answer, but his eyes flicked to the water pail beside him. She knelt and offered it to him, keeping her distance. He drank slowly, each swallow sounding like it hurt. When he finished, he looked at her again, studying her face like he was trying to decide if she was real. "You fell," she whispered, unsure if he understood English. "You were hanging out there. I cut you down." He said something low in his own tongue, words that rolled like the wind and carried more weight than sound. She couldn't understand, but the tone wasn't threatening. It sounded like gratitude, or maybe disbelief. He lay back again, his body trembling from weakness. She stayed a while longer, making sure he didn't slip back into unconsciousness. When he finally slept, she stepped outside to catch her breath. The sun was high now, and the land looked peaceful again, though nothing felt peaceful inside her. The rest of the day passed in slow work, patching holes in the roof, mending a chair, trying to keep her mind busy. But every so often, her eyes drifted toward the barn. She couldn't stop thinking about him. Who was he? How long had he been there, and why? By evening, she made a small fire outside and warmed some beans in a pot. The simple smell filled the air, reminding her how long it had been since she'd eaten properly. She took a bowl to the barn and found him awake again, sitting halfway up. His eyes followed her as she approached. She placed the bowl near him, careful not to startle him. "Food," she said gently. "You should eat." He hesitated, then reached out, taking it slow, his movements cautious but not hostile. He ate a few bites before looking up again. "Why?" he asked quietly, his accent thick, but words clear enough. The question caught her off guard. "Why what?" "Why you help," he said. She didn't know how to answer. "Because no one deserves to be left like that," she said finally. "Not out here, not like that." He studied her for a long time, then nodded once and said nothing more. The wind shifted outside, rustling the dry grass. The sound reminded her that the world beyond that ranch was still dangerous, still watching. She wasn't sure what kind of trouble might come from sheltering a man like him, but something told her his story wasn't done. Later, when she returned to the house, she lit a candle and unfolded the crumpled letter from the man who'd sold her the property. She read it again, slowly this time. It was short and strange, written in hurried scrawl, warning that the land had a history and that it wasn't for everyone. She'd taken that to mean the place was simply run down or unlucky. But now she wondered what kind of history he'd meant. That night, she dreamed of the windmill. In her dream, it wasn't broken but spinning fast under a stormy sky. The Apache stood beside it, his face hidden in shadow, and when she called out, he turned toward her with eyes that glowed like firelight. She woke up sweating, her heart racing, unsure what part of it was dream and what was memory. When morning came again, the barn door stood open, and for a second her heart dropped. She thought he was gone. But then she saw him outside, standing weakly in the sunlight, looking toward the hills. The rope still lay on the ground where she had cut him free. He didn't turn when she approached. "You should rest," she said softly. He shook his head. "No rest. Men come back." Her stomach tightened. What men? He looked at her then, his expression hard and tired. White men. Same who put rope. Her blood ran cold. She had thought the ranch was forgotten, but now she understood. Someone had left him here to die. They might return to make sure of it. He looked past her, toward the horizon. They take land. This land, not theirs. She followed his gaze, the empty plains stretching wide and endless. The thought that she'd spent all her money to buy stolen land sent a chill through her. Maybe the letter's warning hadn't been about bad luck at all. Maybe it had been guilt. The Apache looked at her again, his voice low but steady. "They come again soon." Her pulse quickened. "How do you know?" He touched the earth with his hand, as if feeling something through it. "Tracks fresh." Smoke eased. She turned her eyes toward the far hills and saw it, a faint gray ribbon rising into the sky. A campfire. Someone out there, watching. Fear gripped her. But beneath it, something else flickered to resolve. She didn't know who those men were or what they wanted, but she knew she couldn't face them alone. The man she had saved might be the only one who could help her now. As the wind picked up and the smoke drifted higher in the distance, she understood something she hadn't before. This land wasn't just a place to start over. It was a place already soaked with someone else's story. And now hers was tangled in it. The Apache turned toward her, his voice rough but certain. "You stay. I make safe." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that maybe saving him had been the right choice. Not the mistake everyone in town would call it, but as she looked at that rising smoke, she knew their quiet life on that lonely ranch was already over. The past wasn't buried here. It was waiting. And now, it had found them both. The morning light was thin and gray, stretching long shadows over the open land. The woman stood on the porch, staring toward the far hills where the faint smoke still curled against the sky. Her heart beat heavy in her chest. Whoever those men were, they weren't far. She could almost feel them out there, watching, waiting. The ranch that had felt so quiet yesterday now felt exposed. Fragile. Inside the barn, the Apache worked in silence, his movements slow but steady. He was regaining his strength, though every step looked painful. She had given him a clean shirt from her small trunk, and though it hung loose on his frame, it gave him back some dignity. He was mending a piece of broken harness now, his hands moving with practiced patience. When she came near, he looked up briefly, his dark eyes calm but alert. "They still there?" he asked quietly. She nodded. Smoke still rising. He went back to his work, his expression unreadable. "They watch. They wait until night." His tone made her uneasy. "How do you know?" He glanced toward the open door. "I know their way." Something about the way he said it made her believe him. He had likely seen men like that before, men who took what wasn't theirs and left ruin behind. She sat down on a bale of hay, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her shawl. "This ranch," she said softly. "It was supposed to be my start. I didn't know it was taken from anyone." He looked at her again, not with anger, but with something like understanding. "You not know," he said, "but now you do." The truth in his words sat heavy between them. She had bought the land fair by law, but the law didn't make it right. Somewhere in the past, the dirt beneath her feet had been claimed by blood and loss. As the day stretched on, tension hung over the ranch like a storm cloud. She went about her chores trying to quiet her nerves, fetching water, sweeping dust from the porch, checking the mules' feed, but every sound from the distance made her flinch. The Apache stayed near the barn, watching the horizon, listening to the wind as if it spoke to him. Near noon, he disappeared behind the barn. When she went looking for him, she found him crouched low, examining the ground. "Tracks," he said. "2 horses. Close now." Her breath caught. "Coming here?" He didn't answer right away. They ride slow. Maybe they wait. Maybe they scare. She felt her stomach twist. "What do they want?" He straightened up. "To finish what they start." His words hit her like a chill. She knew then that whoever had left him hanging hadn't meant for him to live. And if they found him here, with her, a woman alone, carrying a child, it wouldn't end well for either of them. That evening, clouds rolled in thick and dark and the air smelled like rain. The Apache began preparing the barn quietly. He gathered what little they had, the mule, a small knife, the axe, and stacked them near the door. She didn't ask what he planned. She could see it in his face. He meant to stay and fight if it came to that, but she had another worry burning in her chest. The baby had been restless all day, kicking hard enough to make her wince. She leaned against the wall, breathing slow. He noticed. "You hurt?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice shook. "Just tired." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You stay inside. I watch." She wanted to argue, but there was no point. The way he stood, shoulders squared and eyes steady, she knew he wouldn't change his mind. She went back to the house, but she didn't rest. She sat by the window, watching the field between the house and the barn. The windmill creaked in the wind, its broken arms groaning. The sky grew darker, and lightning flickered far off over the plains. Every flash made her heart jump. Then, just as thunder rolled low across the distance, she saw it movement near the far fence line. 2 riders, dark against the stormlight. She rushed to the door, calling out toward the barn. The Apache stepped out within seconds, already alert. His gaze went straight to where she pointed. He didn't hesitate. He walked toward the fence, slow and cautious, his hand gripping the axe handle. The riders stopped their horses halfway across the field. They were white men, rough and lean, with rifles slung across their backs. One of them called out, his voice carrying across the wind. "You there? This land's not yours to keep." The woman's pulse raced. The Apache said nothing, only stood his ground. The second man spat on the dirt. "We left you hanging, savage. Should have finished it then." Her stomach turned cold. They weren't just passing strangers. They were the ones who had tried to kill him. The first man raised his hand, holding a small folded paper. "We've got claim to this place, lady. You best pack up before the law comes for you too." She stepped forward onto the porch. "I bought this land fair," she called back, her voice trembling. "I've got the deed." The man laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "Paper don't mean a thing if the land was stolen first." The Apache didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on them, calm but full of fire. The riders exchanged a look, uneasy now that he was standing before them alive. One muttered something to the other, and they pulled their reins. Turning their horses away, the woman let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. But the Apache didn't relax. He watched until the riders were gone beyond the hills. "They come back," he said quietly. "With more?" That night, the storm broke. Rain poured hard against the roof, and thunder shook the walls. She couldn't sleep. Every flash of lightning made her imagine riders charging out of the darkness. She sat by the fire, her hands over her stomach, feeling the baby twist and kick. The Apache stayed near the door, silent as stone. Now and then, he'd step out into the rain, scanning the darkness. When he came back, his hair slicked down, he said only, "Not tonight." She looked at him, her fear mixing with gratitude. "You don't have to stay," she said softly. "You could leave, go back to your people." He shook his head. "No people left here. Soldiers take camp. My brother's gone." The weight in his voice made her throat tighten. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "He didn't look up. They take everything. Then they sell it back." His words echoed through her. She thought of the man who sold her the ranch, the one who never told her its story. Maybe he had been one of those men. Maybe all along she'd been part of the same cruel circle without even knowing. The fire burned low, and the rain eased near dawn. She finally drifted into uneasy sleep, waking to gray light and the smell of wet earth. The Apache was gone. Panic jolted through her until she saw him outside near the windmill, kneeling by the dirt. He was covering something with stones. When she walked closer, she saw it was a small bundle, the old rope that had once held him, now folded and buried. He pressed his palm over the stones when he finished, then stood. "Bury the past," he said simply. She nodded, though her eyes stung. "And what about what's coming?" He looked toward the hills again. "We face it." For the next few days, they worked side by side. He repaired the fences, set traps, and taught her how to load the small pistol she'd found in a drawer inside the house. She practiced, her hands trembling at first, but growing steadier. They spoke little, but silence between them started to feel like trust. Still, tension lingered in every breath of wind. She saw signs now, fresh hoofprints near the creek, a broken branch along the trail. The men hadn't forgotten. They were circling, waiting for their moment. One evening, while she was tending to the mule, she noticed something new by the old oak tree near the edge of the property, a crude mark carved into the bark. It was shaped like a cross, deep and rough, freshly cut. Her heart thudded. When the Apache saw it, his expression darkened. "They marked the land," he said. "Say it's theirs." She looked at him, voice trembling. "But it's not, is it?" He shook his head. "No, it never was." That night, they didn't light the lanterns. The house stayed dark. They sat by the window, watching the horizon. The silence between them was heavy with what they both knew the riders would return. And this time they wouldn't just be two. The woman pressed her hand against her stomach, feeling the baby's faint movement. "If something happens," she whispered, "promise me you'll get the child safe." He looked at her, his eyes steady. "Nothing happened. Not while I breathe." His voice carried a quiet strength, and for the first time in days, she let herself believe him. Yet as the wind picked up again, carrying the scent of smoke faintly from the east, she knew the peace they'd built on that broken ranch was running out of time. Somewhere beyond the hills, the men were coming back. And when they did, everything the land, the past, their fragile bond would be tested. The storm hadn't ended. It was only waiting to break again. The air had turned colder over the next few days, sharp and restless, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The woman woke before sunrise most mornings, sitting by the small window with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the sky shift from gray to pale blue. The Apache was already up before her each day, moving through the fields quietly, his steps leaving only faint marks in the dirt. He checked the traps, gathered water, and kept watch. Neither of them said much. But every look they shared held the same thought. They were waiting for something. The days had grown tense and hollow. Even the mule seemed uneasy, pulling at its reins and pacing in the barn. The woman tried to keep busy, sweeping, cooking, pretending normal life still existed, but the unease crawled beneath her skin. Sometimes she thought she could hear faint sounds from beyond the property, the clink of metal, a horse's distant snort, or men's. Voices carried faintly on the wind. Each time she froze, listening, her heart hammering until silence returned. One morning, she found a dead crow lying by the porch. It hadn't been torn by an animal. It looked placed there. She stared down at it, her stomach twisting, then looked toward the hills. She didn't need to ask who had done it. When the Apache saw it, his expression turned grim. "They close now," he said. "Too close." Her voice trembled. "What do we do?" He didn't answer right away. He walked to the edge of the yard, scanning the horizon. Then he said, "We stand." The words were simple, but his tone left no room for doubt. He started reinforcing the barn, dragging wood and nailing boards across the lower openings. She helped as best she could, her hands blistering from the rough work. The sound of hammering echoed through the still air like a warning. By evening, the clouds gathered again, thick and dark. The land felt heavy, as if waiting. The Apache moved around the property in silence, setting up barriers, checking every line of sight. The woman stayed near the house, packing what few belongings she had into a small trunk. If something went wrong, she wanted to be ready to run, but she also knew there was nowhere safe to go. When darkness fell, she lit a single candle inside, keeping it low. The Apache came in, his face shadowed by the flame. "3 men now," he said quietly. "They wait behind the hill. Horses tired. They come at dawn." Her throat tightened. "You saw them?" He nodded once. "I smell smoke from their fire." The baby stirred inside her again, a soft flutter she could feel deep in her ribs. It reminded her what she was fighting for. Not land, not pride, but survival. She sat on the floor, her back against the wall, trying to keep her breathing steady. The Apache leaned against the window frame, watching the darkness beyond. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. When the wind started to rise, the sound of the broken windmill creaked and moaned. An eerie groan that carried across the plains. She had grown used to it before, but tonight it sounded like something alive, warning them. Every few minutes, lightning flickered far off, throwing brief flashes across the land. In one of those flashes, she thought she saw movement near the hill, shapes shifting in the dark. She rose to her feet. "They're coming," she whispered. The Apache didn't move, only lifted his chin slightly. "Not yet. They wait for dark to hide." The next hours crawled by, slow and tense. The candle burned low, and the night pressed heavy against the walls. She could hear the wind carrying faint noises, hooves, whispers, the quiet metallic sound of rifles being readied. Her pulse quickened until she could feel it in her throat. Suddenly, the mule screamed from the barn. The sound split the silence like a knife. The Apache grabbed the axe and was out the door before she could stop him. She followed as far as the porch. Clutching the doorframe for balance, the yard was swallowed in darkness. The only light coming from the flashes of lightning across the horizon. She could make out his shadow moving fast toward the barn. Then a gunshot cracked through the air. She screamed his name without meaning to. Another shot followed, and then silence again. Heavy, complete silence. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might stop. Moments later, he reappeared, running toward the house, a rifle in his hand now. His jaw was tight, his breath quick. "One gone," he said. "Two still there." Her legs nearly gave out from relief. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head. "No, but they move fast. They not wait for dawn now." Thunder rumbled louder, the wind rising around them. The woman hurried to close the shutters while he poured water into a small tin cup, then loaded the rifle carefully. Every click of metal echoed through the house. Then the first blow hit the door. It wasn't a knock, but a hard, sharp strike that made the wood shudder. She jumped, clutching her belly. Another hit followed, then another. The Apache moved toward the doorway, his voice calm. "Stay low." The door gave under the next hit. Splinters flew as it cracked open, and a figure stepped through. A man with a wide-brimmed hat and a rifle raised. The flash of lightning lit his face, one of the riders from before. His expression twisted when he saw the Apache standing there alive. "You should have stayed dead," the man spat. The Apache didn't answer. The two faced each other in the flickering light, one holding a gun, the other an axe. Then the gun went off, loud and blinding. The woman dropped to the floor, covering her ears. When she looked up, the gunman was down, his rifle kicked away, and the Apache was standing over him, breathing hard, but there were more outside. Shouts echoed through the wind, angry and close. A window shattered behind her, sending glass raining across the floor. She crawled toward the corner, trying to protect her stomach. The baby kicked again, hard this time, as if sensing the fear in her body. The Apache turned toward her. Go to the barn, he shouted. Go now. She hesitated, her voice breaking. What about you? I follow. He said. She ran, her boots slipping on the wet ground as she crossed the yard. The rain had started again, cold and fast, soaking her dress. Another gunshot split the air behind her, and she ducked low, clutching her belly. The barn loomed ahead, dark and open. She stumbled inside and pressed against the wall, shaking. Seconds later, he came through the door, dragging one of the barrels across to block it. His shirt was torn, a dark stain spreading near his shoulder, but his face stayed steady. They try again, he said, breathing hard. She looked at him, fear filling her chest. You're bleeding. He wiped at it quickly. Not bad. Stay quiet. Outside, the sound of horses grew louder. The men shouted to each other, their voices rough with anger and drink. They were circling the house now, maybe counting, maybe deciding their next move. Lightning flashed again, showing brief shapes of them moving through the rain. The Apache crouched near the doorway, gripping the rifle. She could see the determination in his eyes. The same calm strength she'd seen that first night when he'd opened them after hanging near death. For a long moment, there was only rain and wind. Then, faintly, she heard a voice outside, one she didn't recognize, deeper, older. Give him up, lady. You're harboring a killer. You don't know what you're tangled in. Her blood went cold. She knew that voice wasn't just speaking for himself. That was the kind of voice that believed its own cruelty was justice. The Apache didn't move. He whispered low, he lies. They kill my kin. Burn village. I run. They hang me here to show others. The truth hit her like a blow. She felt a mix of anger and shame. In this land, she asked softly. His eyes met hers. This land was ours before theirs. Outside, the men began moving again. The rain grew heavier, pounding the roof. One of the horses neighed sharply, startled by thunder. Then came another gunshot. This time it hit the side of the barn, wood splintering near her head. She cried out and ducked. The Apache fired back through the crack in the wall. The sound was deafening inside the small space. One of the men outside shouted and fell, his voice cutting off fast. But that only made the others angrier. More gunfire followed, bullets tearing through the boards. The woman crouched low, pressing her hands over her belly. She could feel pain tightening through her abdomen now, sharp, sudden. Panic surged in her throat. Something's wrong, she gasped. It's too soon. He turned to her, eyes wide. You stay still. Breathe slow. The pain came again, stronger this time. She clutched the straw beside her, trying to steady herself. The gunfire outside kept going, flashes lighting the cracks in the wall. The storm howled louder, as if the sky itself had joined the fight. The Apache fired once more, then ducked back beside her. He reached out, his hand rough, but steady on her shoulder. Hold on, he said. When light comes, we move. She tried to focus on his voice, on the rhythm of his breathing, but the pain blurred everything. Each contraction came faster, tighter. The world outside was chaos, gunfire, thunder, rain, but all she could feel was the life inside her pushing to come into a world that wasn't ready. The Apache looked toward the door. Then back at her, torn between two battles, the one outside, and the one happening right there on the barn floor, outside. The men shouted again, closer this time. The sound of boots splashing through mud echoed near the wall. One voice called out, loud and furious, "We're taking back what's ours, one way or another." The Apache lifted the rifle again, his jaw set. The woman gasped as another wave of pain tore through her. Her cry swallowed by thunder. Rain poured harder, wind howling through every crack in the barn. The Apache stepped into the doorway, raising the rifle, his figure framed against the storm. She reached for him, her voice trembling. "Don't leave me." He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers through the dim light. "I come back." Then he stepped out into the rain, vanishing into the dark as the thunder rolled across the plains and the battle for the ranch began. The rain didn't stop until morning. It fell through the night in long, heavy sheets, soaking the ground and washing away the blood and dust that had gathered around the small ranch. By the time the first light touched the horizon, the wind had quieted. Only the faint cries of crows echoed across the hills. The barn stood half-broken, one door hanging loose on its hinge, the scent of smoke and gunpowder still lingering in the air inside. The woman lay on the straw, her face pale, her body trembling. The pain had come fast and hard through the night, waves that left her gasping and crying quietly to herself. But when the first gray light crept through the cracks, the world shifted again. A new sound filled the barn, soft, weak, and fragile. The cry of a newborn. She held the small, wrinkled baby close to her chest, tears falling silently down her cheeks. The Apache had not returned yet. She could still hear faint movement outside, the low groan of a horse, the drip of water from the eaves. Every sound made her tense. Then, through the open doorway, she saw a shadow move. For a heartbeat, fear took her again. But when he stepped inside, she saw his face, streaked with mud and rain, blood dried along his arm. His eyes met hers, and everything inside her loosened. He moved slowly toward her, his breath heavy from exhaustion. He knelt beside her, his hand brushing gently against the baby's cheek. "He live," he said softly. She nodded, too weak to speak. "A boy," she whispered after a moment. "He's strong." The Apache looked at the child with quiet awe, as if seeing something he hadn't believed was possible. His hand trembled slightly when he reached to touch the baby's hand. "He come in storm," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Storm bring life." For a long time, they sat there in silence, the rain dripping through the roof, the baby's soft cries filling the space. The woman finally spoke, her voice raw. "Are they gone?" He looked toward the open fields. 3, not rise again. 1 ran when thunder came. He'd not return. She let out a slow breath. Relief and sorrow tangled inside her, impossible to tell apart. "So it's over," she murmured. He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the horizon where the rain was thinning into mist. "For now," he said quietly. "But others come one day. Always do." She looked at him, her heart aching with something deeper than fear, something close to gratitude and grief at once. "Then we'll be ready," she said. He turned his gaze back to her. And for the first time in years, there was something almost peaceful in his expression. "You are a strong woman," he said softly. "Stronger than any I know." The words lingered between them like a promise. By midday, the rain stopped completely. The sun came out weakly through the clouds, lighting the wet earth and broken boards around the barn. The Apache buried the men quietly near the edge of the field. He said no words over them. He didn't need to. The land had its own way of remembering what had happened. The woman stayed inside, feeding the baby what little milk she could. She sang low under her breath, the kind of song her mother used to hum when the world felt heavy. The child's small fingers curled around her own, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the faint pulse of hope. When the Apache returned, his clothes were torn, his body stiff with pain, but his face calm. "They not come back soon," he said simply. "Horses gone. Fire out." She nodded, though her eyes filled with tears. "What will you do now?" He sat down across from her, leaning back against the wall. "I stay until you heal. After, I go south. To my people." She wanted to say something to ask him to stay, to tell him she couldn't do this alone, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she looked at the baby in her arms. "Then you'll see him before you go," she said softly. He smiled faintly, a rare, quiet smile that reached his eyes. "He has your eyes," he said. They spent the next few days repairing what they could. The roof was patched, the animals fed, the door replaced with rough boards. The woman still moved carefully, her body weak from childbirth, but she refused to rest for long. The Apache tended the fire each night, his rifle always within reach. As the days passed, the silence between them changed. It was no longer filled with fear or uncertainty. There was understanding now, a kind of quiet bond forged through survival. Sometimes, when the baby slept, he would tell her small pieces of his story. How his people had been driven from their lands. how his brother had been taken, how he had escaped that hanging only to wander half-dead until she found him, and she told him her story in return. How her husband had died from fever 2 winters ago, how she had tried to keep the ranch alive because it was all she had left, how loneliness had settled over her like dust that no rain could wash away. In those long evenings, something unspoken passed between them, not romance, not quite friendship, but something steady and human. One evening, when the sun was setting low and the sky was painted gold, the Apache stood by the fence, looking toward the hills. The woman came up beside him holding the baby. "He sleeps better now," she said softly. He nodded. "He's strong. We'll live." She looked at him for a moment, the light catching on the scars along his neck. "Will you really leave?" He hesitated. "Yes, my place not here. If I stay, men come again. They bring law this time, say I killed white men." Her heart sank, though she knew he was right. "Then where will you go?" He looked out at the endless plains, far south, where no one remembers names. "Maybe find what left of my people." She nodded slowly. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the smell of wet earth. "You saved us," she said quietly. "You saved me." He looked down, his expression unreadable. "You saved me first." The silence stretched between them again, heavy but not cold. She reached into her pocket and took out something small, a silver ring, dull and worn with age. "It was my mother's," she said. "For luck." "Maybe you should have it," shook his head. "It belongs to you." But she pressed it into his palm anyway. "Maybe luck can travel," she said. He looked at her, then at the baby, who stirred slightly in her arms. "When he old enough," the Apache said, "tell him story of this place. Tell him it not just yours. It belonged to all who bleed on it." She nodded, her throat tight. "I will." At dawn the next day he saddled one of the surviving horses. The woman stood by the barn door, holding the baby close, watching him prepare. The air was still, the land washed clean by the storm. He climbed into the saddle and looked down at her. "You safe now," he said. "Keep fire burning. Keep child strong." "I will," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, but instead he simply nodded. Then he turned the horse toward the open plains. The sound of hooves faded slowly into the distance until there was nothing left but wind and the cry of a hawk overhead. The woman stood there for a long time, her heart heavy yet full. She looked down at the baby, who blinked up at her with calm, curious eyes. "We'll be all right," she whispered. "We'll make it." Years later, the story of that night still lived quietly in the land. Travelers who passed the ranch spoke of a woman who survived a siege with only her courage and the help of a wounded stranger. Some said the Apache spirit still guarded the hills. Others said they saw him riding through the plains whenever a storm rolled in from the west. But for her, it wasn't legend. It was memory of rain and fire, of fear and strength, of a man who had come back from death only to save another life. She never forgot him, and when her son grew old enough to ask about the ring she kept by her bed, she told him the truth. She told him of the storm, the night he was born, and the man who stood against death to protect them. She taught him that kindness could come from where you least expect it, and that not every battle was fought with hate. And as the boy grew strong and tall, with eyes like his mother and the quiet steadiness of the Apache, the land began to heal too. The fields grew green again, the barns stood firm, and the sound of laughter returned to the house that had once known only silence. The woman often stood on the porch at sunset, watching the sky burn orange over the plains, her hand resting lightly on the baby's old cradle. Sometimes, when the wind was right, she thought she could hear the faint echo of hoofbeats in the distance, fading toward the horizon, and she would smile, whispering softly into the breeze, "Ride safe, my friend," and she would turn back toward the house, where the fire waited warm, steady, and alive, just like the memory of him.